Me again. So we've had this saying, this phrase, it all belongs. We've had this around, in and around Sojo for many years now. But really, I think it's been this past year or so. It's been this past year or so during virtual church, like days today, where it's kind of risen to the forefront. And maybe that's because we have welcomed so many more folks, literally from around the world, into this community. It all belongs. Or maybe because virtual church has given us so many opportunities to celebrate when things go, quote, wrong. Whatever, it all belongs. But whatever the reasons, it truly has become a part of who we are. So for the past couple months, Kate and I have been giving these spiritual nuggets that have been trying to explore this phrase with a bit more precision. Like, what do we actually mean, and maybe what don't we mean by these three words, it all belongs? 2 weeks ago, I began working out how this phrase might fit within the context of a faith community like ours that is comprised of religious diversity. Meaning within a group of people who span the spectrum of a whole host of religious beliefs, how can they all realistically belong? Like, how does it all belong fit within this context? And for my guide through this, I've been listening to how Paul engaged with this, I think, specific issue within the churches in Rome. And we've covered over the past couple of weeks how most people in these early Roman churches believed that things like dietary laws and religious festivals were relics of the past and no longer adhered to them as part of their religious expression. However, there were some among them that felt differently. Last week, which was part 2 of this kind of series within a series, I clarified the differences between core values and doubtful matters. For Paul in Rome, and then also for us here at Sojourn, there are some things that are so core to who we are and to what we do that we can't realistically say that we welcome diversity of beliefs in those areas. But for all other things, and maybe you might even say for most things, we really do try here at Sojourn to hold a big tent with space for wide diversity of religious beliefs. And one thing Paul was clear on was that both groups of people, those who abstained from meat and those who ate everything, both were equally part of the community. So at stake here was not who's in and who's out. Again, those would be more core value type issues. But rather, since everyone is in, that will inevitably lead to differences in opinion and belief. So then how do we handle that? And although he gave specific instructions to each side, if you recall from last week, to the one group he said, stop judging everyone who's different from you. And then to the other group he said, stop despising or looking down on those who are different from you. Ultimately, Paul's opinion was that those who ate everything, they shouldered the greater responsibility between these two groups. And this group he called the strong in faith. Whereas those who abstained from meat and didn't drink wine, and those who believed that some days are more sacred than others, he called weak in faith. And I've been delaying talking about these two terms, weak and strong, until I had the chance to really dig into them, which is what I'd like to do together with you now. But before we go on, just as a way to reset and recalibrate, I invite you to take a deep breath in with me. And exhale. And so now, God, as I continue sharing my thoughts on this, may we always remember that my thoughts are just my thoughts, that there is no expectation that everyone who hears them believes them or accepts them as true or agrees with them. And so my prayer here is that if there is anything that I say that is good, that is true, that would be helpful for us as individuals or us collectively, then maybe that would be a thing that sort of rises to the surface, that sticks to our heart and minds. And then conversely, if there's anything I say that is untrue or would not be helpful for someone, then good gravy, just let it slip out our ears the minute I say it. Let's just forget it. One more deep breath in and out. So I've been thinking about these two terms, the weak in faith and the strong in faith, and what it is that separates these, and why Paul would have even used these terms that, to me, on their surface, have these qualitative differences, meaning kind of sounds like one is better than the other, right? Like strong is better than weak. It kind of sounds like that. And I've landed on two different ways to think about the differences between a weak type of faith and a strong one. And the first has to do with maybe two different approaches to what I'll call existential peace, which is like, am I okay? How do I know if I am or not? And then the second has to do with a progression along a spectrum of what I'll call an examined persistence, which I submit is not the most easy phrase to say, but I really liked how they both were EP. So existential peace, that's the preacher in me. What? I am who I am. Existential peace and examined persistence. So I'll start first with this idea of two different approaches to existential peace. So there's this quality of life. Jesus called it abundant life. Paul described it in terms of like fruits of the Spirit. I think even Brene Brown, when she talks about wholeheartedness, is attempting to name this quality of life. But whatever it is that we call it, we're trying to articulate a kind of reality where we are grounded in what is most real and true. And here at Sojourn, we talk about that as our truest identity as fully beloved children of God. This mode of being alive, this quality of experience, it involves a level of peace, or as our Jewish ancestors would call it, shalom, this shalom deep within. And so this is why I call it this existential peace, because it's the sense that we are, in the final manner of things, okay. It's like the disillusion of all the anxiety about death and loss and suffering. But even more than that, it's a kind of flourishing. It's living in the here and now with this mindset that trusts, as my friend Ryan Meeks puts it, that life is a gift and love is the point. So the ones that Paul called weak in faith, they, as I see it, they clung to some old ideas of their religious tradition that this kind of peace, this type of flourishing is directly connected to believing the right things and behaving the right way. This kind of faith, comparatively speaking, I would say is smaller, it's more constrictive, and by nature, it churns out a very judgmental attitude toward those who don't believe or behave in the same way. Hence, Paul telling the weak in faith, don't judge others. But then by contrast, there's another kind of faith that's more open and expansive. And in this worldview, maybe our standing with God, maybe our identity as beloved children of the divine, maybe the reality of our capital B belonging is not dependent on believing the right things or following the right kinds of laws and rituals. This, for Paul, is a stronger type of faith. We open our hearts to the possibility that we are loved just as we are, regardless of the color of our shadow, entirely and completely. That there is nothing that can earn that love, and there's not a damn thing that can take it away from us either. So then why might, for instance, as in this passage in Romans 14, why might the belief that one should abstain from meat or wine, why would that be called weak? Why would that be a weak kind of faith? And I think it's because it establishes false lines of who's in and who's out, who's clean and who's unclean, entirely based upon, are you believing the right things? And do you behave the right way? And then to add insult to injury, this sort of weak faith is often wrapped up in rather antiquated and arbitrary ideas. And we talked about that briefly at the end of last week, where I suggested that maybe a more conservative approach to life is one that believes that truth and goodness have already been figured out long ago in the past, and so now we just got to hold on to it with clenched fists. Whereas believing, as Paul did, that nothing's unclean to eat, drinking wine is not bad, ideas like this break down this dualism of wrong and right and in and out. In other words, it's fine to eat and drink because at the very heart of it, you are fine. So this is one way I think that we could differentiate between the weak and the strong in faith with regards to how does your faith relate to this peace at an existential level? Must you earn it or be worthy of it through right thinking and right action? Or is it a gift to be enjoyed independent of any ideas about dirty and clean, in and out, etc.? For Paul, a faith that is small, protected, extracting, dividing, exclusive. This is a weak faith, whereas a faith that is big and open, comfortable with paradox, welcoming and inclusive is strong. And then the second difference, as far as I see it, between these two types of faith has to do with how we might actually move from a weaker kind of faith to a stronger one. Reinforcing this idea that there are maybe two poles on the end of a spectrum, that it's not so much fixed categories of weak and strong, but it's like weaker and stronger. And for now, did the thing again where it disappeared me.
What is it doing?
I don't know. There's something about... I don't know. It's twice now that the Spirit of the Lord has just wanted to end me early. Okay, so anyway, not fixed categories, but maybe a spectrum. And I think moving along this spectrum, I call this examined persistence. And I hope that will make sense in a minute. So the other day, I was talking with my buddy Justin Lee. Justin's the author of Torn, one of the most well-read and well-recommended books when it comes to integrating faith and sexuality. And I asked him if he'd share his thoughts on what he sees as some of the gifts that he's noticed in his life as a result of him being gay. And he told me that his orientation actually contributed to the strengthening of his faith because it forced him to look outside his family, outside his church, and outside his religious structure in order to discover and develop a faith of his own. Because, and I know so many of you can relate, Justin's family and church did not take kindly to him coming out as gay. He found himself on the outside, looking in. And yet, like so many of you, and I know this because I know many of you and I know your stories, it was precisely because he and you were on the outside that you developed the kind of faith that you did. And Justin explicitly named this newer faith as being stronger as a result. I wouldn't be shocked if many of you feel the exact same way. So what if that's the thing that moves a person from a weak faith to a strong one? Meaning a faith where everything works for you, where the beliefs and, okay, this is getting frustrating. I'm sure I did something wrong. How about I pause this little animation right here? Okay. All right. So where was I? Okay. What if the idea, well, here's my thought. A faith where everything works for you, where the beliefs and the practices, they work as expected. That is a type of faith. Yes, 100%. But when that faith stops working for you, maybe you've exposed its limitations, experienced its smallness. Maybe the rules and the rituals and the boundary markers suddenly become restrictive and exclusive. Maybe you've left that system voluntarily or you've been unceremoniously booted from it. Should you discover a faith on the other side of that, my sense is that faith on the other side of the one that worked for you will inevitably and predictably be stronger. If for no other reason than because it's a faith that you've fashioned by you and for you, as opposed to one handed you from a family or community. This kind of faith, the one that you find on the other side of what you were given, is almost always more genuine, more authentic, and more free because you discovered it in and during the dark nights of your soul. It's almost like faith needs to be stress tested, like as though we're doctors, bankers, or engineers. Because doctors, they conduct stress tests where they hook the patient up to the machines and have them run on a treadmill. Why? Because exercise makes your heart pump harder and faster, which can then reveal where the problem areas are with your blood flow. In other words, you may not know where the problem areas are until you stress test it. Or consider the banking industry, who, since the collapse in 2008, have developed all sorts of stress testing principles that alert banks to potential areas of failure and show them where the risks are. A weak bank, that's one that's never been tested. But a strong one has endured and overcome challenges. And then furniture companies. You go to IKEA and you see those silly little machines that show you how they stress test, which I don't actually believe the IKEA ones, but the idea, they stress test their furniture to evaluate safety and durability. If a chair has never really been tested, who knows how much weight it can sustain? The strong chair is the one who's been broken, redesigned, and rebuilt with all new foundations. When something's never been tested, never been evaluated or critiqued. Perhaps just because, it's just always been like this, or hey, man, it seems to be working fine for me for now. That thing is inherently weaker than the one that's faced real life tests, undergone scrutiny, and experienced the kind of death and rebirth. As a result, I believe this faith is better off for it. So if one distinction between weak and strong is how it responds to our existential peace, then the other difference, I think, has to do with the kind of examined persistence, meaning it's been examined, it's been tested, it's been questioned and doubted and scrutinized, and on the other side of the testing, on the other side of the breaking, there it remains, yet not as it once was. For now it has persisted through the rupture, and it is precisely this persisting through the rupture that provides the durability, the vitality of our faith. Without such testing, without such overcoming, can we ever know the true depth of peace and joy and love? I mean, one might even say, unless you are born again, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. So weak faith is untested. It prefers and it maintains the status quo because it still works. And we see that in our society today, don't we? People for whom things work well, and as a result, they resist growth and change or the dissolution of their old way of life. How many white identifying people are not all that motivated to rock the boat or tear down oppressive and racist systems because why? Because it's working just fine.
Yeah.
Or how many straight identifying people lack incentive to fight for the rights of trans people or to stop states from rolling back protections of LGBTQ people? Why all this change? Things are fine. They've been fine. Strong faith, by contrast, it's the faith on the other side of the status quo. It is discovered by those who experience ways in which their faith no longer worked for them, where what we've always been taught no longer holds up, where what we've always believed suddenly seems untenable. Those moments where the God we thought existed ceases to act in accordance with any of our expectations. Moments when the very people, the very community that we trusted to model unconditional love to us instead prove just how conditional it was the whole time. There's a lot of ways this can happen, right? Where the faith we once knew stops working for us. Things that become the catalyst for the stress testing of our faith, the shifting us away from a weaker faith and towards something stronger. For example, some of you, like Justin, identify LGBTQ, and the faith you were raised in said, it's not okay here. Or maybe you're a woman who grew up being told that your place was in the home and to be quiet and subservient to men. Or maybe the status quo shatters because you're black and the police pull you over for no damn reason. Or you're Latino and the shopkeeper eyes you suspiciously. Or you're Asian yet you feel constantly like an outsider in your own country. It can happen when someone close to you dies way too soon or suffers some freak accident or is diagnosed with some terminal medical ailment. Or maybe you just grow up and you leave your home, you go to college, and a whole new world of scientific knowledge blows massive holes in your tiny, biblically informed worldview. However it might happen. And my assumption is if Sojourn is your home church, then it's happened to you at least once, if not multiple times. When our faith stops working for us, sometimes we're invited to lean in a bit further, if we so desire, and if we are able to, and discover a stronger, freer, more open kind of faith on the other side. In Jesus' day, there was this giant veil that hung in the temple, dividing the space between the common and ordinary world with what was called the Holy of Holies. And only the high priest could ever pass through that veil into the Holy of Holies, where it was believed that God's presence dwelled. And only one time of year at that. The veil, in other words, symbolized a belief that God was not accessible to all people, that there were specific hoops to jump through and requirements to meet in order that you might ever get close to the divine. In one of the accounts of Jesus' crucifixion, witnesses said that upon Jesus' death, this veil in the temple was rent in two, top to bottom torn. As though Jesus' death took down the veil, this symbol of a weak faith, because it divided and separated. It created in-groups and out-groups. Why does that matter? Because if nothing else, the movement of Jesus was about dissolving such boundaries and showing people there is no God behind the curtain. Because God, as Paul said, is the one in whom we live and move and have our being. Strong faith knows this, or at least chooses/tries to believe it. Strong faith is grounded in our identity of beloved children of God, independent of human ideas about right beliefs and right behavior. And strong faith is made strong when the aforementioned beliefs and behaviors are stress tested. When life, through circumstance or suffering, tears the veils in two and thrusts us to the threshold where we might decide to either move forward in freedom and openness and love and trust and mercy and compassion and grace, or retreat into the safety of things like tribal mentality, shared beliefs, and special sacred rituals that have the unfortunate side effect of slicing up the world into good and bad, right and wrong, black and white, us and them, in and out. Okay, so hopefully that helps a bit with wrapping our minds around this idea that Paul articulates between those weak and strong in faith. And I mentioned it last week that I've often struggled with these terms because it just felt elitist. It felt pejorative to call his own faith strong and others among them as weak. So much of it has to do, doesn't it, with like what you've experienced in life and how you've responded to some of life's invitations and what you've found through acts of great suffering and great love. So maybe stronger isn't necessarily better than weaker. It's seen some things. It's a bit further down the road. It's just got new lenses, different lenses to see things in a different way. And these lenses were often acquired at great cost. But at this point, you might be asking, why does it matter? Why spend so much time trying to nail down the distinction between the weak and the strong ends of the spectrum of faith? Well, and this is where I think the rubber starts to meet the road a bit, and where maybe some of us might not fully love the odor of the burning rubber. Because, like I've mentioned a couple times now in this series, including at the top of this message, I suggest to you that when it comes to holding the space for religious diversity within a faith community like ours here at Sojourn, perhaps the onus falls on the shoulders of the strong. It is to the strong, after all, that Paul writes, welcome those who are weak. And when Paul writes in verse 19, so let's strive for the things that bring peace and the things that build each other up. This is not a 50-50 split between the weak and the strong. He's talking to the strong in faith. It's up to them to strive for the things that bring peace and build up the community. He tells the strong, I want you to abstain from eating meat and drinking wine if it causes your siblings in the faith to stumble. Notice he doesn't say to the weak, good gravy, get over it already. It's fine, just eat a steak. Listen to how Paul presses in upon those on the stronger end of the spectrum. Verse 15, if your brother or sister is upset by your food, you're no longer walking in love. Verse 16, don't let something that you consider to be good then be considered and criticized as wrong. And verse 20, don't destroy what God has done because of food. And in their context, if the strong in faith enjoyed their liberties, which meant in this case eating and drinking, with no mind to the impact on those among them for whom such inactivities were still viewed as wrong, Paul says they run the risk of undoing the work of God, which for me is just a shorthand way of saying undoing the unifying of this diverse community for the shared vision of a radical new way of being human. And to be clear, this isn't because the weak in faith will be offended by people eating and drinking. Paul's not like coddling their feelings. He said that earlier in the chapter, it's because they might actually then feel pressured to join in on the eating and drinking before they've grown in their consciousness to see that it's okay to do so. And we talked about this last week. Like if someone does something that they believe to be wrong, even if perhaps subjectively is maybe not wrong, it actually is indeed wrong for that person. And so this is why Paul looks to the strong in faith and says, hey, if this thing falls apart, I'm blaming you. Now, obviously, we don't have to agree with Paul. We're free to disagree. We're free to feel like his instructions are not applicable or helpful to our community. However, and this is what I outlined in the first part of this message 2 weeks ago, in this particular area of building healthy, sustainable faith communities comprised of all sorts of diversity, including different religious beliefs, I personally find Paul to be a reliable guide. And so I'm trying to really listen and sit with his take that the strong in faith, the more progressive, more open, more free ones in the community are ultimately called upon to defer their liberties and make the larger space so that the more conservative ones among them feel like they belong in the community as well. In other words, if this thing is going to work, it's because the strong in faith defer and hold space for the weak. But I said it last week, and I'll say it again now. I think there are exceptions to this. Exceptions I don't think Paul acknowledged. And this is why I only grade Paul with a B+, and maybe even a B the more I think about it, on his pastoral instructions here. Because I think some key things are missing. I understand that his opinion should be that the stronger, more progressively minded folks are the ones who should bear the weight of holding the space for the weaker ones. I'm also a firm believer that Paul was either unaware or pastorally negligent in not naming that oftentimes, hang with me here, I'm almost done, oftentimes those who move along this spectrum toward the strong end of the faith have endured significant trauma during that shift. We know now, for example, way better than they did 2,000 years ago, how it can impact people when they are shamed by their religious community. We know how it can impact people when they're ostracized by their own family. We have far greater insight into the harm done by toxic theology and untrue ideas about the nature of God and the sinfulness of humanity. So while yeah, it is true, a person does develop a much stronger faith on the other side of their stress testing, it's also true that in that context, certain words and ideas and songs, as we found in church, can trigger that trauma in ways that I think the weak in faith need to hold space for as well. And that's the thing I don't think Paul names here. And that's where I'll pick up next week, as I start to put some tangible handholds on how all of this can play out in a community like ours, striving for wholeness, yet consisting of so many diverse parts.